recording. There we go. Right, well, we'll kick off. So welcome everybody to this joint Labour for European Future and Friedrich Ebert Stiftung webinar. And we're joined by the brilliant Clare Moody, former MEP for the Southwest and Gibraltar. Christos Katsioulis, who is the London head of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung office, and Catherine West MEP, Shadow Minister for Europe and the Americas, as you all know. And Fabian Hamilton is just about to join, and Fabian is a Labour Party MP in Leeds. So the context for today obviously is Brexit, Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which we are now over about 3.5 months into. And I think, as we all know, it's not going spectacularly well, unfortunately. And there's a whole host of problems. Of course, most of the problems that have been talked about in the press so far have talked about the economic aspect of that and the trade aspect of that. And of course, Northern Ireland, the impact it's having there, not only on the economy, but also in terms of the peace process, which is the subject of a whole other webinar. It is one of the most deeply concerning things that's going on. But we're here today to talk about security and defence, because one of the things that was covered very thinly in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was future agreement between the UK and the EU in terms of security and defence, and also just crime and policing. So we're going to be talking about those issues today, and I think my own view is that these issues will become increasingly important in the public sphere as problems manifest themselves, and as probably the news agenda moves on to some degree from the pandemic, and people have more time and attention to pay to these things. But I'm sure that our speakers will go into great more detail than I would be able to. So without further ado, we will come across to Catherine West. Catherine, thank you for joining us again. And we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I'm just going to add Fabian to the screen, but otherwise do carry on.
Thank you, Mike, and I'm so glad that we've got this date eventually, because we did try, I remember, with Connor, and then we had to cancel for various reasons and so on. So I'm glad we've got a good panel, and I'm looking forward very much to hearing other speakers as well. Obviously, we're all aware that the Trade and Cooperation Bill hasn't managed to cover many of the issues that we wanted to in detail on security. And as ever, I believe that's because, you know, the UK government was keen not to pin too much down, and because of their rhetoric around the European army and all these sorts of nonsense positions that it used to talk about, it was keen not to get into that kind of discussion. I want to refer just briefly to two documents which I've found really useful in the last few months. The first one is the integrated review by the government, and the second one is Robin Niblett's paper, which has come out of, is it Russia or Chatham House? He's our senior guy, I've got it right here.
Chatham House.
Chatham House, and he is wonderful. I've been on a panel with him, and he basically boils everything down to, in the end, when push comes to shove, our friends, our allies are the Europeans and the Americans, of course, and particularly in an environment where democracy is really being challenged, that we need to put aside our differences. And I have felt in the last week, since we had a church service for Prince Philip in the constituency, and I was thinking, what are we going to do with 8 days of mourning, when at first all the election preparations were off and everything. And I said in my remarks in the church, let's use the 8 days to put aside our differences and to think about what really matters. And I just keep coming back to the fact that in the end, when we are up against it, and when it comes to security and safety, it's our European friends, not just the geography and where we are positioned, but culturally, our history, you know, the history, the cultural import of the Holocaust and what we escaped in the 1930s and where we are now. It just continues to come back to the fact that, you know, we are increasingly being shown in all sorts of different ways that we need to stick with our European friends through thick and thin. Now, obviously, you'd all be aware, having watched the news, that the Ukraine as an aspirant EU member state is being threatened at the moment by the mobilization of many thousands of Russian troops and a huge array of military equipment. And as we all know as well, this comes 7 years after the illegal annexation of Crimea, the first annexation of land from a European nation state since World War II, and a stark reminder that the borders of nation states can be and will be challenged by authoritarian states where there's an opportunity and a motivation. Now, we've seen the television footage of NATO and the Ukrainians, and a firm line is being taken on the mobilization and on Mr. Putin's saber rattling, not disconnected to the fact that Alexei Navalny is getting a lot of coverage at the moment in prison in Russia, in inverted commas. And so we will, of course, be wanting to defend as much as we can the flank there in the Ukraine, and we all feel as well that it is a test, isn't it, for Mr. Biden, for his new presidency, and Putin will be wanting to have this display of strength to see what will the US do, what will the UK do, what will the NATO partners do, what will the European Union do. So basically, our security is Europe's security. Europe's security is Britain's security. And we know that the British forces deployed in countless European countries, and have been since World War II, have served side by side with partners from Europe, and not just in conflict zones in the areas that I've described, but also, of course, in Africa, working together with French colleagues and friends around the terrorist threats, and of course doing a lot of really good work through our DFID budget, which was the DFID budget, of course, now coming under the FCDO. But these are the sorts of areas where we will be working with European friends and neighbours. Now, of course, I also know that Fabian will be remarking specifically on the importance of multilateralism, which is the key word in our shadow foreign team, which Keir has given us to work on. He's asked us to focus on multilateralism because the UK seems to be very good at breaking alliances rather than making alliances. And increasingly with the wider threats, which I've described tonight, but, you know, in general, the wider threats around China, for example, we do need to be pulling together and not, you know, seeing, I would argue, smaller differences between us and European countries. Some of the rhetoric in our media is deeply unhelpful, and I think it's a sort of it's like a security blanket, which sometimes the government goes back to pull out some of the old tropes that it's used during the Brexit debate when it's having a bad day. But I feel that we need to be pulling together now with that risk that we see to the east with Putin, and also with China. Just very briefly on the question of the espionage and looking at cyber arrangements. Once again, European cooperation absolutely crucial. We saw, for example, when we had the attack in Salisbury 3 years ago, where chemical weapons were deployed, it was the Europeans who came to our moral defence, as well as supporting us and supporting our science community around trying to identify the chemical attack. And it was very obvious to us then that it was the European partner standing shoulder to shoulder with us and expelling the Russian diplomats and intelligence officers, which led to a really robust defence of Salisbury, of the innocent people like Dawn Sturgis, Nick Bailey and others who were affected. But that threat really is just sleeping. It hasn't really gone away. And we know that Parliament's Russia report has signalled not just the hard power issues, but also the threat that we have to our democracy in the UK. And many of you would be aware that there was Russian interference in the 2019 election, but that the government said there wasn't anything in the Brexit in the referendum. Many journalists would not agree with that, like Carol Cadwalla, who's done a lot of research in this area. But disinformation is a really troubling and very dangerous element of our cyber world. The companies like Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, who we're trying obviously to hold to account over taxation and financial arrangements, also have a role to play in terms of making sure that disinformation doesn't corrode our democracy any more than it should. And so I would like to see the government introducing proper measures to deal with the Russia threat around our banking systems, around the shell companies which are still in our offshore entities. The Cayman Islands and the BVI, British Virgin Islands, are still the two worst in terms of the UK jurisdictions around transparency. And of course, looking as well at the role of soft power. So we know, for example, that Mr. Lebedev's son, Mr. Lebedev, was very close to Yeltsin back in the day, Mr. Lebedev Sr., and his son, of course, owning the Independent and Evening Standard newspapers, but a great supporter of Mr. Johnson. And Mr. Timurko has given £1 million to the Tory party in the last couple of elections. So these are people who have still got links in with Russia. They're not necessarily best friends with Putin, and they say that they're not, but I don't understand how you can do business in Russia without having some kind of connection or some kind of relationship with the Kremlin. And if anyone's read Catherine Belton's book, Putin's People, I can strongly recommend that. I'm going to wind up there now, but I just wanted one final thing to say. We know on the broad spectrum of our security that obviously much of our work that was being done through the National Crime Agency, the tracking of drugs from Colombia through our ports and through the ports of Rotterdam and through Amsterdam and so on, a lot of that work has been affected by some of the changes to immigration, by some of the treaties which we failed to sign, which have kept open various warrants, the European arrest warrant, and kept open a lot of those channels. And I really want the government to redouble efforts now that Brexit, kind of politically, the sting of Brexit has left the debate. I want them to be pragmatic and to join with Europe and strengthen our ties there. I've got some more points to make, Mike, but I will try and wind those into the wider debate when we come to the questions.
Brilliant. Catherine, thank you so much. That was really fascinating, as always. Lots of things to be worried about, but some very constructive comments as well, so thank you. Fabian, I'll come straight across to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Fabian is Labour Party MP in Leeds and a good friend of ours, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you, Catherine. Thank you to all of you for inviting me this evening to speak to you. My dear colleague Catherine West, as you know, holds responsibility for Europe on Labour's front bench, and she's doing excellent work on how a Labour government would work and will work with our European allies and partners to counter the threats, some of which she's outlined this evening, to our security and well-being. Now, my role as Shadow Minister for Peace and Disarmament is solely focused on multilateral disarmament and arms control. So that's what my remarks will concentrate on this evening. As Catherine said, the UK's defence goes, I believe, hand in hand with Europe's. And it's absolutely vital that we continue to work closely together to tackle all and any threats to our respective national security. I think a commitment to the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons has historically been a joint endeavour between the UK and Europe. And alongside the last Labour government, and as the only other nuclear power in Europe, France ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which brought the threat of nuclear brinkmanship and the catastrophic human and environmental impact of nuclear testing in Europe to a complete end. Now, France, Germany, and the European Union also played absolutely key roles in negotiating the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, the JCPOA. And earlier this month, UK and European representatives led the Joint Commission of the JCPOA as we continue our search to get an agreement and bring Iran back into compliance. But I think there's still so much more work that needs to be done in order to guarantee that we don't all suffer from the destructive capabilities of these terrible and terrifying weapons. For example, France and the UK both have still not committed to a no first use policy and haven't yet pledged never to use nuclear weapons against conventional forces. However, we have come a long way since the dark days of the Cold War and the existential threat that was posed to all of humanity at the time. But it was thanks to Europe that we avoided conflict at all. détente began across Europe, with Ostpolitik healing the division between East and West Germany. The progress and stability that it brought to the world was unprecedented at the time. But there are still at least 150 nuclear weapons stationed in Europe by the United States, including in Germany, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey. Following the extension of New START between the United States and Russia, I think it's vital that the UK and our European allies work together to negotiate a new broader treaty in time for the eventual expiry, I should say, don't want to use the American word, of New START in 5 years' time. And as the only nuclear armed states in Europe, the UK and France, I think, have a huge role to play in developing this treaty alongside the non-nuclear armed states, particularly the ones that have foreign nuclear weapons stationed on their soil. I'd like to touch now, excuse me, on how the UK government's decision to increase the number of nuclear warheads we hold from 180 to 260 might impact on our relationship with our European partners. Firstly, I should make it absolutely clear that the Labour Party totally opposes these increases. It flies in the face of the UK's historic commitment to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in the year of its 50th anniversary review conference. And it's just another example of this government saying one thing and, as usual, doing the complete opposite. Once again, the British government's out of step with our allies and has isolated the UK, I believe, on the world stage. For more than 50 years, we've had a twin-track nuclear strategy under all governments. First, to maintain the minimum level of nuclear weaponry needed to deter the most extreme threats to our national security, and second, to use our position as a nuclear power and only one of 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council to help broker multilateral controls on these appalling weapons. Now, the government has seemingly abandoned multilateralism and embraced unilateralism, which will rightly worry our friends in Europe and could impact on our ability to work together on issues of serious national security. A world free from the threat of nuclear weapons, in line with our obligations under Article 4 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is only achievable if we work with our non-nuclear armed allies in Europe. And I believe the government has undermined both the UK's commitment to both international law and to Europe with this reckless act. It also damages our credibility when negotiating with rogue states such as Iran or Saudi Arabia, who are looking to acquire nuclear weapons. In 2021 alone, the United States has already deployed B-1B nuclear bombers to Norway for the first time. Russia reportedly tested a new class of nuclear-tipped torpedoes on its submarine cruiser, and China successfully conducted an anti-ballistic missile test and has reportedly expanded construction of ICBM launch facilities. UK-European partnership is desperately needed to counter these worrying steps, and I fear that the current UK government has made that nearly impossible. Mike, before I bring my remarks to an end, I'd just like to discuss an area of silent conflict in Europe, but one that could cause widespread instability for Europe and the UK should it erupt, and that is Cyprus. As one of the guarantor powers for Cyprus at the UN, the UK has a key role to play in preventing possible conflict between Turkey and the Republic of Cyprus. But our European allies also have a huge interest in protecting Cyprus, given its membership of the EU and its proximity as part of the bloc. In the run-up to the P5+1 talks later this month, Labour's been clear in its support of a bizonal, bicommunal federal political settlement for the whole of the island of Cyprus. And we've also been clear that if this situation is to be resolved, Turkey must withdraw all its military forces from Cyprus immediately or in a phased way and halt all drilling in the Republic of Cyprus's exclusive economic zone in the Eastern Mediterranean. But the Foreign Secretary recently suggested that he could, again unilaterally, change the UK's historic and long-standing position on Cyprus by tacitly supporting a two-state solution. Now, this would have a direct implication for Europe's security and peace in the region. There would also be consequences for the UK's security, given that we have 2 sovereign air bases in the country. this is an area where the UK and Europe have to work closely together in order to prevent possible conflict. Since the Second World War, the UK and Europe have a rich history of preventing and ending conflict in the former Yugoslavia. And I think it's time for them to act together to prevent possible loss of life once again in Cyprus, where it's been successful before. Europe has a strong and proud history of making the world a safer place. And I think it's incumbent on the United Kingdom government to work as closely with them as possible to do our bit as well. Thank you, Mike.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fabian. That was fascinating and really valuable contributions. Thank you very much. Right, without further ado, I will come across the wonderful Clare Moody, regular contributor. Thank you very much, as always, and brilliant former and we hope future MEP. So across to you, Clare.
Thank you, Mike, for the very, very kind words. And it's also a real pleasure to be, I can't say platform because we're all online, but to be talking with Catherine and with Fabian and with Christos as well. So it's always a pleasure to work with these colleagues. I mean, just listening to Fabian's utter, and Catherine's as well, reasonable explanations of what the Labour position is in relation to our relationship with the EU and the reasons for that. I wrote down at the beginning of my notes for what I was going to say this evening is that if you were to step back and take a rational approach to how, given where we are, I mean, never mind the rational approach to Brexit or the irrationality around that choice, given where we are, a rational approach to all the things that the UK is facing on all of those fronts, you would be looking to work closely with your neighbours, our neighbours, on issues that matter to this country. And it's heartbreaking that we are not working. We are not seeing this country behave in any, in that rational way on these really, really important issues. So if you look at the international order, if you look at the strategic environment, the EU and the UK are facing exactly the same issues. We are, if you're looking at that in kind of the geopolitical sense, then clearly we are looking at the situation with China. Most immediately, if you like, as Catherine said, we are looking at the situation in Russia, how Russia is behaving on the borders of Ukraine, saber rattling again. I think this time more saber rattling than the action in 2014, but nonetheless, it's done with the fact that of what Russia has done before and Putin's track record of pushing, and if he doesn't meet resistance, he'll push again. So, looking at Russia's behavior in that very concrete geographical way in relation to Ukraine, which, by the way, followed what it did in 2008 in Georgia, and the two territories in Georgia that had been annexed effectively, but complex wording, but nonetheless, what happened with Abkhazia and South Ossetia was down to Russian actions as well. And indeed, the line was drawn between what happened in Georgia to what happened in Ukraine because there wasn't sufficient pushback at the time in relation to what happened in Georgia. And then you can look at Russia and China's actions in online. In the Catherine made mention of this in terms of the interference in democratic processes and other points as well. I was told that the May administration refused to let the security services investigate whether there was a Russian involvement in the Brexit referendum. So she couldn't say categorically they weren't involved because she didn't want to let anyone look. But that I'm afraid is historic now. But also, if you're looking at our strategic environment, then you are looking at climate change. And if we are going to deal with climate change is going to have consequences in the security and defense sphere, exactly as it's having consequences in all the other spheres of our lives. And so if we are going to effectively tackle climate change, COP26 later this year, G7 summits, etc., the work that is being done on this, where the UK has historically had a really good track record, and I'm very proud of the work that was started with the Labour government in setting up the Department of Energy and Climate Change, subsequently abolished, but the first Climate Change Act as well, which again we can proudly lay claim to. But if we are going forward, work on these issues to concrete outcomes that actually deal with the problems that are in front of us and therefore prevent problems in the security and defense arena, as I said, in other arenas as well, then it is so blindingly obvious that we have to be working with the EU on this as our neighbours, but also in those multilateral forums that where the EU has such a strong voice and where the EU is instrumental in making a difference, both in those forums, but also in terms of the regulatory role that the EU has as well. So you've got that context, you've got the China context. I touched on China. I won't go into too much more detail around that. You've then also got the EU as kind of an actor in other points that we are interested in, and in this context you'd be sort of the global Britain idea. One of the roles that we played was as being a kind of, the UK had all these international relationships, a lot to do with our history over recent centuries, but we can have that conversation as well. But those relationships meant that we were a good way, and our language, to be fair as well, but for so many reasons, we were a good way of other countries around the world talking with the EU too. We have destroyed that basis as well in that context. So the things that the UK were good at were not things that anyone did an assessment of or a recognition of when they were looking at designing or the Brexit negotiations for the UK's exit from the EU and the UK's relationship with the EU going forward. Because it seems to me that what Brexit, Johnson and Frost's and others Brexit has done is actually undermine so many of the UK's strengths, and it's made us weaker on the global stage, including in this particular topic of conversation for this evening's meeting. I will touch two more points. One is, very briefly, I will touch on what Fabian said about the nuclear proliferation and the astonishing, absolutely astonishing decision by this government to increase our nuclear arsenal against any backdrop, just at the point when the Americans are looking at renegotiating the START treaty, after we've moved on from Trump and all that was going on with Trump. You've got an environment where most of the non-proliferation negotiations were US-Russia. You've seen since those negotiations, since those treaties were kind of established and built up, you've obviously seen proliferation elsewhere around the world, most particularly with China, but also in other countries as well. What are we saying to those countries by increasing our nuclear stockpile? What role can we possibly hope to play in this crucial international negotiations if we have said, well, we're going to do it, but you can't? It's the most destructive decision for absolutely no gain that I can find. I've looked and I cannot discern any gain to the UK in increasing our nuclear weapons. So I'm genuinely mystified and shocked by that decision. But finally, when it comes to our domestic security and what is the situation around us and our relationship to our neighborhood. And again, this has been touched on previously, but the way we have left the EU and the sovereignty debate, so therefore, no sort of joint working in so many spheres, means that we've come out of SIS2, which is a data exchange agreement. The Schengen information system that we were part of as a member. Now, there are complications around us being able to access that as a non-member state. I mean, there were complications with us accessing it as a member state because we were outside the Schengen zone. So, but one of the hard facts around all of this is that there were 6, I'm trying to remember the exact number, but I think, Christos, forgive me, I've lost this number in my head right now. I think it was 6 million impressions. There were 6 million interactions with the SIS2 database. I mean, it was going on thousands of times a day. When people crossed our borders, then we got that information from other EU authorities. The relationship now that gets trumpeted by the Home Office, that we've got some kind of relationship with Europol, all of this is simply shockingly inadequate compared to what we have had before. And this is genuinely about our security. We have not taken back control of our borders. We have lost control over our borders because we don't know the history of people crossing our borders. And that is a serious loss to us in the UK from that. And you look at the 7/7 bombings in London, one of the people responsible for that was, effectively ran away to Italy because of the European arrest warrant and our being a member state inside the European Union. We were able to get him back within weeks. We simply wouldn't be able to do that now. It just wouldn't be possible. So, these are things we have lost. We've lost that as a country. We've lost that protection of our borders. We've lost that information about our borders. But we have also diminished ourselves on the world stage, and all the areas that we are interested in, we have made our lives so much more difficult. And breaching international treaties, the threat of it the long-standing threat of it last autumn with the Internal Markets Bill and what's happening with the Northern Ireland Protocol, these add reputational damage as well as practical damage to this country. So we are going through a rough time on the world stage right now as a country, and we desperately need to start recognizing that and then working towards repairing the damage that we have done. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Claire. Lots covered there. Thank you so much. Right, last but very much not least, we will come across the brilliant Christos. So Christos runs the London office of Friedrich, Ebert Stiftung, which is a German social democratic think tank. So Christos, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thanks all for joining this event. The problem to speak as the last speaker on such a brilliant panel is that everybody has touched upon all the main issues already. So I'll try to look at it from another way. And before I was heading the London office and another office abroad, I was advisor to the SPD MPs in the Bundestag on foreign affairs and defense. And I remember these times fondly because we always worked very closely with Labour colleagues. And there was a kind of admiration because of how the United Kingdom managed to deal with international affairs, was able to build bridges and build alliances all over the world. And that has kind of changed. So looking at the EU-UK relationship, I'll look at it from a European perspective. And the interesting thing is Catherine mentioned the integrated review. If you look at the strategic update of the French foreign policy, which was published a few weeks ago, and if you look at the debates going on in Germany about the military white book that will be published probably in May or June, it's a very similar assessment of what's going on. Russia is named as the most acute threat in the integrated review. The same applies for France, and the same will apply also for Germany. I'm quite sure of that. Then there's the acknowledgement that China is a competitor, is maybe even a systemic challenge, and there is a need for this tilt into the Indo-Pacific, which is quite close to what the United States is doing, the main ally in NATO. And then there is the acknowledgement that security is a far broader issue than just military issues. Claire mentioned climate change. There is a mentioning of trade and the need of making our societies more resilient. There is the question of how to deal with regimes in kind of sanctions and the stopping of illicit or dark money flows. There is the question of how to deal with cyber threats, with new threats coming up through technology, be it artificial intelligence or the mingling with election processes all over Europe. An American senator in a debate this morning mentioned the need that we as European and American allies need to be on the technological edge to deal with these issues. Now, if you look at Germany and France and the UK, the matter of fact is that we're dealing with three middle powers on the global stage that are dependent on an international rules-based order that is also kind of allowing for the free development of our democracies. We're not the United States, we're not China, we're not Russia, we're not global superpowers. So we need to put our weight a little bit into the debate. And the logical conclusion from this assessment will be to build alliances, to work together. The European Union is one of these, is one format, one platform where Europeans try to bring their forces together, first of all, to build peace in Europe, which they acknowledge and which they achieve. The second thing was, that was mentioned before, Northern Ireland. That's also a peace project by the European Union. And I'm thankful to Fabian, who mentioned Cyprus, because it's the same model. You can't only deal with defense alone here. You need to bring together the different aspects of security. And another fact for the United Kingdom to acknowledge is, and I think this government is very bad at that, is the European Union is the main reference point for allies like France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and all over Europe for many of these questions. If you want to challenge, or if you want to find a solution for climate change, if you want to deal with illicit money flows from Russia, if you want to impose sanctions on Russia or people in the Russian regime, this is not a NATO issue for most of the Europeans, it's a European Union issue. So you need to have this bridge with this cooperation with the European Union. Otherwise, you won't be able to achieve many of the aims you have put down in the integrated review. And let me finish with a quip a former chancellor, an SPD chancellor, made about the US-UK relationship, the special relationship. He said, it's such a special relationship that only one side knows it's a special relationship. I'm sorry to quote that here. But one of the main points or the main abilities of the UK has been to bridge the United States discourse with the European discourse and to allow us to integrate more closely and to work better together. And I'm afraid that there might be a danger to losing this ability if this government continues to decouple the United Kingdom from the European Union. And from my point of view, that would be a huge loss from progressives all over Europe. That would be a huge loss. And so I'm hoping for a Labour government as soon as possible to rebuild some of these damages been done by the current government. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Christos. And thanks to all of you for fascinating contributions. and all deeply worrying in their own way. But it's better that we are fully aware and apprised of the situation that we're in, so that we can build towards a better future for us all. Which is why we're here. So any questions, please raise your hand using the raise hand tab in the under the reactions button, or post in the chat. So we've got a few in the chat, so I'll come to those in a second. But firstly, one question from me. So it strikes me that we are talking about a whole host of different things, I suppose, in a way, because we're talking about both about UK security, as in, police and crime cooperation, police cooperation, how that affects crime and borders and so on. So some of this is very domestic, parochial, UK focused, and I think that's probably the easiest bit to explain to the public. As in, our police forces can't talk to their police forces anymore. That's a problem. And somebody does something bad here and they run away to Italy, we can't get them back, and we used to be able to do that. Those are quite easily explainable, although I suspect that most of the public are completely unaware that those things have happened. But the rest of it, in terms of security, as in our security as a nation, both in terms of somebody flying over and dropping a bomb, or more likely somebody getting into the country and then doing something like the Skripal poisonings or something else, that is a problem, and a significant one. And also global security, as in our ability to influence that, both through our soft power, but also through our hard power, has been diminished. And also, I was just thinking, and I think it would be true to say that the ability of the European Union itself to have influence on a global scale has been diminished, partly because the UK itself is diminished, but also because we're not part of it anymore. So there's no benefit to this. Nobody wins. And certainly nobody in Europe does. And I don't think the US does either, actually, because I think the US wants a strong Europe. So, but these latter 2 points, about UK security in and of itself, and also about our global influence, for all the talk of global Britain, I think all of this is harder to make the public interested, and hard to make the public care, and even harder to make the public understand, partly because, our country has been safe, bar 1 or 2 incidents like the Skripal poisonings and Litvinenko and so on for such a long time. Obviously, with the very important exception of the Northern Ireland conflict from the the 70s to the 90s, and the fact that there were recurrent bombings and attacks on mainland Great Britain as well as in Northern Ireland. Of course, we hope that those don't recur. So, get to the point at the end of a very long question. Where do we start with the British public in trying to raise awareness of these issues, given that the government is actually pretty good at the media spin on Brexit, just as on everything else? And also at the moment, nobody's got much time or attention for anything other than the pandemic. Catherine, you raised your hand, so please.
Thank you, Chair. One thing that none of us covered really, always touched on it, but I wonder if audience members might also come back, and I know that Richard Corbett's here as well. I feel what's really in front of us at the moment is the Scottish question. It's looking as though, Nicola, there's no doubt about Nicola Sturgeon, 53% in the polls. Despite going through that big scandal and everything that would have, if that had been Labour, we would have been at 20% anyway. Because the fact is, as we all know, it's a sort of a puzzle. Because Brexit and Boris Johnson and the way that he runs Westminster is so hated in Scotland, it just makes her stronger. We want to stay together because we know that strategically we need to stay together as a union. The Tories call themselves the party of the union, but if you look at the fact that it took a whole week for Boris Johnson to come out with one pithy little tweet when the children were, running wild in Northern Ireland for a variety of reasons, lockdown, but a lot of it is around identity and Brexit. I feel that the big issue in front of us and because you and I, Mike, we meet about once every 6 weeks or so, I think the issue for tonight that I'd love to hear feedback from is about the union. I mean, if Scotland get an overwhelming majority for another referendum, and if that referendum does happen, I mean, I don't want it to happen at all. I hate them after Brexit, of course. I can't stand referenda. I didn't like the first Scottish referendum. But what do we do about that? And what do we do about that as a Labour movement? And also, obviously, Northern Ireland, which we all feel deeply passionate about. And Mike, obviously, with your Irish background and being in LPIS and everything, you're very, very committed as well. But Fabian, as the peace champion within the Labour Party, and Clare, who's been around and has seen, you know, the 1990s and the Good Friday Agreement, the way it was all stitched together. The only thing I can think of is because Biden has got such a heart for Ireland. He says, you know, my heart is Irish, and quotes Seamus Heaney and everything. I just hope that he holds the line on some of the Brexit things, which means that somehow the Good Friday Agreement sticks, that the negotiation has to happen. The UK's got to give way on the veterinary science point. I mean, if anyone was thinking about veterinary science checks when they went to the polls in 23rd of June 2016, it's ridiculous. You know, but we just don't seem to have very good negotiators. They don't seem to be able to see the politics. So anyway, I just feel as though, you know, what do other people think? But I'm deeply worried about Northern Ireland, about Scotland, and even Fabian and I can tell you that within the Parliamentary Labour Party and within Parliament itself, you know, a lot of Welsh communities feel left out. And actually they're starting to think, well, maybe Clyde's got the answers. So it's like, and then of course that really weakens us from a security point of view. For a start, where does the government get its new 80 more warheads from if Faslane suddenly becomes not part of the UK? Like, do you know what I mean? How much risk assessment has the government actually done on its review that it's put out, its independent review around Scotland not being a part of it? So sorry to have more questions than answers, but I will use the defence that we are still in opposition and we're consulting on our manifesto for 2023. But we appear to be more the Union Party. We're in favour of the Union. So that's how I feel sort of in my heart. But how are people going to vote? I think it's deeply, deeply problematic. And of course, it just comes back to the fact that for some of our enemies, for Russia, etc., they're just going to be rubbing their hands together because we'll just be weaker, be able to just steamroller over us. So that was just one idea that came to me that I thought would be really good to hear from others. Thanks, Mike. I'm sorry not to give an answer to a question.
No, that was all really helpful, and I agree with you on all of that. And I'm sure that our enemies, including Russia, have been incredibly happy over the last 5 years anyway, because we've spent so much time wasting energy on ourselves and our internal conflicts, which were completely manufactured. I mean, 10 years ago, people were worried about being in the EU or not, instead of holding Russia to account over its actions here and over its actions in Eastern Europe, and particularly in Ukraine and the Crimea and so on. It will have given Putin, you know, a great deal of leeway to do all the things that we know about that are awful, and I'm sure many, many more besides, and not just Putin, of course, as well. Anybody else? Claire, Fabian, Christos, did you have a response to my extremely long question?
So I think, talking about the context that we're working in, we need to, again, I'm afraid, reflect on why we are here. And there is a dreadful tendency. You know, the question was asked, I think, about how can we make the rest of the, you know, how can we make the population aware of how, you know, what has happened to the UK in the international fora. And, you know, we are a very self-absorbed nation, and we are spent, you know, 5 years talking about ourselves, you know, talking to ourselves about ourselves, and, you know, that doesn't look, you know, that has been observed on the international stage. Sorry, Richard, we're losing Richard Corbett, so before he got a chance to speak, but it was nice to know you were there. So we in terms of how do we get this over to the British people, it's a really, really tough question, because we have a media that likes to prolong and promote that little Englander. And I use the term Englander term, you know, little Englander term advisedly, that it promotes, there's this exceptionalism about us. And so, you know, we're somehow better, we're somehow different from everyone else. the joke, the very, very old apocryphal headline of a newspaper saying fog in the channel, Europe cut off, is how a lot of our press would like to promote this vision. But there's also a kind of optimism bias, and I think Catherine made mention of the referendum in Scotland in 2014. I know from colleagues just how poisonous that was. That was a really nasty referendum. And yet, a year later, Cameron thought it was okay to call a referendum across the UK, because that wouldn't, we wouldn't have the same thing. And we wound up in a worse position, even, with the depth of division within the country. So I think, we've got an uphill battle, but we have got an opportunity with that, but it is down to all of us as individuals to make these points, to talk these points, and to raise the profile of these issues. We can't rely on anyone else. I have no doubt that my fellow three panelists have had the same conversations with people from outside the UK who have just looked slightly slack-jawed and gone, what on earth is happening to your country? But that message is not getting through to our citizens, so we have to therefore make that message clear ourselves.
Thank you. Fabian, you had your hand raised.
Yes, thank you, Mike. Firstly, thank you, Claire, for the points that you've made so very well. I agree totally with Catherine that we are in imminent danger of the breakup of the Union of the United Kingdom, and that is a seriously frightening prospect, actually. And Christos, you said something very interesting in your contribution, which I thought was absolutely relevant, that security is more than simply about how many arms we have or what military resources we have. Security is actually about how prosperous people feel they are and how that prosperity is spread throughout the nation. And it seems to me that once the pandemic is over, the British government, the Tories, Johnson and his crew of clowns will do their very best to blame every economic woe on the results of the pandemic. But that won't wash when they see Europe recovering and other parts of the world recovering far more quickly. And I think that as it dawns on the British public that actually our economic lagging behind, and I hope I'm wrong on this, by the way, because I don't want to see further suffering amongst my constituents or Catherine's or any other MP in Parliament or any of the British population. But if that happens and we do lag behind economically, who are people then going to blame? How long can they carry on blaming the pandemic or the last Labour government? It won't wash. And I think that as long as the Labour Party has some very clear redistributive policies based around public services and the funding of those services for everybody, in the way the Scandinavians have previously been so successful at doing, then we might begin to claw back not just some of the support for our social democratic socialist view of what society could be, but actually for collaboration with our European partners and how successful they are. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We look at the most successful nations in the European Union and the Union itself and see what life could be like had the Tories not dragged us through this unnecessary, destructive referendum and Brexit. That's the position we have to be in. And that's how we can regain not just our prosperity, but also our security. And you're right, Claire. My experience too is that Britain has become a laughingstock in international fora. We've got to reverse that. And we can reverse it in some of the ways I've suggested.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Right. I will come to some questions. Unless you want to comment, Christos, I will come to questions from attendees. So David Blackman, you've had your hand up for a little while, so please go ahead.
Thank you. 3 quick points. Cyprus, should Britain remain a guarantor of power? I think Fabian in the past has suggested we should withdraw. Certainly when we should have acted in 74, it was a Labour government that failed to and allowed a Turkish reaction in Cyprus. I think we should stay in, but I'd be glad to use this opportunity asking whether that was Fabian speaking personally, or whether what the Labour position is. Secondly, the Russia report, obviously the Intelligence and Security Committee of the two houses meets rather secretly, but we've we've been writing saying carry on. There's a lot more to do there. Do our MPs get any feeling for what is happening there? And thirdly, the multilateral fora. We're still in the Council of Europe, we're still in NATO, I presume we're still in OSCE, all of which have parliamentary assemblies. To what extent does the Labour front bench talk to our members, the Labour members in those parliamentary assemblies? It seems to me there's a voice on all these issues, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Cyprus, etc., where we should be, our members should be making their voices heard. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Who wants to take that?
Shall I start off with Cyprus, Mike, and then obviously Catherine? Because then
I can do the Russia report after you, Fabian. You
Okay, and I guess some of the international fora, both Christos and Claire can come in on. Look, on Cyprus, David, it certainly has been our position the last few years since I've been covering Cyprus or been involved with it, that there should be no guarantor powers for any European Union member. The idea of the guarantors was based 60 years ago in the Constitution of 1960. It's outdated, and frankly, it's entirely wrong. So whilst I don't advocate us necessarily withdrawing from our bases, our sovereign military bases in Cyprus, we should certainly shrink the amount of land that they occupy, and that's already on offer, I believe, or it was certainly under the last Tory government on offer to the Cypriots as a contribution to a lasting peace settlement. But most importantly, neither Turkey nor Greece nor the United Kingdom should continue being guarantor powers for the independence and sovereignty of Cyprus. And that's certainly a position, unless Catherine contradicts me on this, that's a position we've had up till now.
Thank you, Catherine.
very briefly on the Russia report, Mike, I raised it as an urgent question. Actually, it was brought as an urgent question. I responded for the Labour Party. It would be February now, and I can send you text of that, but really nothing's changed. And in particular, very worrying that so little's really happening in terms of the disinformation side of things. Very, very slowly, there might be something in the Queen's speech on the 11th of May around foreign registration of foreign actors, or, you know, lifting similar legislation from other jurisdictions around registering individuals. But crucially, the money side of things, you know, and this is where really this is the biggest contribution the UK can make, because it's securing the international financial system against fraud. It would help the developing countries. And I think this big move from Biden on the 21% taxation across the board, I mean, hallelujah. I was so pleased to hear that. I thought that's wonderful. He thinks like me. So, you know, I think for me, it just is a bit of light at the moment that what's coming out of the US, they've just appointed a secretary for Labour. I mean, you know, that's what we need. And watching and seeing the workers in Amazon trying to get a trade union, okay, they didn't win the vote, but they had a vote. And years ago, you would never have imagined that the workers would. So I feel that really what the UK can do on Russia, it's got to be about the city, it's got to be about our banking. And once again, if I can give a plug for Catherine Belton's book, I'm sure Christos has read it, Putin's People. It's really a good read. And she goes into so much detail. Of course, all the lawyers have been onto her because she talks about all of the oligarchs. But, you know, London is where it's at. Have you noticed that the property, the huge jump in property prices in London at the top end, that's all that flood of the money. They're paying cash. They've done zero about that. And that's relatively easy to do. Just introduce a law which says you cannot buy property in cash. You know, there's so many things that would be easy for the government to do, and it's failed. So, you know, we will be raising this again with them. In fact, tomorrow, Lord Collins in the House of Lords is doing a piece on Russia, and he will be asking the same questions as I did, because most of the recommendations from the Russia report haven't been touched. And, you know, I just think it's way down their list of priorities. And that's something which we actually really have to kind of push them on.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Keith, you've got your hand up. You need to unmute.
Yep. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, right. Well, it was just really to pick up on Catherine's point about Scotland. I know I keep banging on about it, but it was good to hear that last, what really is a pretty desperate situation, is being expressed, right? I just wanted to make a plug, Mike, for the webinar we've got next week, which is about how Scotland can maintain good relations with the EU without actually leaving the UK as well, right? And I think the information has been sent out by Ben on that, but I just wanted to give a plug to that. And just make one further point. The strongest argument that we have to keep the union together is that what the SNP want to do is another Brexit. That is insufficiently understood, I'm afraid, but that is precisely what we face in Scotland, a second and even more damaging Brexit. That's all I want to say.
Brilliant, thank you, Keith. Did anybody want to pick up on Scotland and have more to say on that thorny subject?
Only that I was astonished to hear Michael, well, no, I wasn't astonished actually, but Michael Gove arguing for the union and using all the arguments that we were making around why the UK should stay inside the EU. That is replete with irony and utterly infuriating. But Keith, good to hear you're doing the webinar, and I think that point you make about it being another threatening another 4 or 5 years of the what's gone on post-Brexit probably is your strongest argument. We will all be there for you if we can help in any way as well.
I think, Mike, given Faslane, I suppose that's all I've got to say. I mean, how are the Conservatives going to implement their strategy if Scotland becomes independent and they expel all the nuclear weapons from Faslane? I'll leave that on the table.
There are lots more questions than answers. Go ahead, Christos.
Just wanted to add one point to the question of David. What I'm really thankful for is that Labour has remained part of the Party of European Socialists. So we do have this strong link between socialists in Europe and social democrats in Europe with the Labour Party. And this is really important. And Richard Corbett is doing a very, very good job. Unfortunately, he left already. But to keep this link open, to keep this channel open and keep talking, because we have the same problems in many of our countries and dealing with the same issues, that's very good. And I'm thankful for that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Yeah. Great. Juliet has got her hand up. Go ahead, Juliet.
Thank you. Following up from what Christos has just said, I'd be really interested in what you think the major issues are, apart from the strategic ones that have already been discussed, that the Socialist Party as a group could really try and work together on and get the British more up to speed of the realities of the way in which Europe has got to face a new strategic environment internationally and Europe's role in the world.
Great, thank you, Juliet. Who wants to respond to that?
So I will, absent anyone else saying anything, I will leap in, Juliet, and say, I thank you for those words too, Christos, because this is a really important relationship for the Labour Party, and that we are still involved and still engaged and being able to work together still. Because many of the advances that we have had in the UK, with or without Labour governments, have been because of EU legislation. And before I was an elected politician, I was a trade union official for 20 years. So one of the things I think we need to do a lot more work on together, which is obviously an agenda being progressed through the EU, is this one around equality, inequality, and that applies in workplaces, it applies to employment contracts, it applies to, but also to the taxation point that Catherine made, and these wider points of kind of coordinating and sharing ideas around how we practically implement policies that make a difference in people's lives. And yeah, that's just the nature, yeah, that's in the very fabric of our relationship, and it's good that we can continue doing that.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Right, I'm going to come to some questions in the chat. So Daniel asked, he said that President Macron and others are pushing for European strategic autonomy with the UK out of the EU. How will its advancement affect UK-EU relations, and how should close partnership be assured? Catherine, did you want to comment on that one? He posted in the chat at 7:40. If you want to.
Great.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. It's just I was trying to answer Dave.
So it's about European strategic autonomy proposed by Macron. How will this affect our relationship with the EU, and can we do anything to get the UK to be actually part of that, or are we liable to be excluded?
I think, as somebody else in the chat put, at the moment, the dance is very much that we have to experience the consequences of Brexit. So we're feeling I think there's sort of some symbolic exclusions that we're going to feel. And I think that that will play out in the coming months because of coronavirus. I think we're seeing that in a way with the debate around vaccinations. But fortunately now it's sort of all got so twisted up with the different vaccinations that it's sort of all coming out in the wash. And also in a way, because we've all had our challenges, either through vaccinations or the death toll in our case in the UK, or whatever element of coronavirus we have failed to deal with. And of course, our economic impact is worse than any other European country. If you look at it though, in a way, I think it's an argument for bringing us together, because it's shown sort of how weak we all are, and how global health is such an important security matter. So I think, once again, in the same way that a terrible conflict can bring people together and make them realise what matters, coronavirus, yes, there's been squabbling over vaccinations and everything, but in the end, it's made us see how interdependent we are. So I see this also on the security piece, that there'll be some sort of, minor squabbles about or how we position ourselves on various questions. But in the end, France and the UK are, friends, and we will need to have that. In the end, it will come good. I'm not sure where we're at in the timing, but just to mention as well, if I were Mr. Macron at the moment, my main fear would be about the right and the fear of the right. And I think when he really is up against it and staring into the eyes of Marine Le Pen again, he's going to know how we feel about Brexit. Not that we all know that Brexit was a very complicated vote, and not everybody who voted for Brexit, of course, was right-wing, but Mr. Farage and Mr. Farage's funders are deeply right-wing and not very nice individuals. And therefore, I think Macron will see actually how hard it is when a lot of people start agreeing with a very right-wing figure. And I think at that point, he'll realise that some of the arguments he's having with us about strategy, it will become a matter of his survival. And I'm dreading the French election. I mean, I think if we end up with Le Pen versus Macron, and Macron has had such a difficult time over his period with the Gilets jaunes and the coronavirus, and some of his personal approaches, which can come across quite aloof and arrogant. If you add all that together, and Marine Le Pen has some luck, he could end up with the first, very, very right-wing, can we say fascist, group. And that, to me, is just so deeply worrying. And there's so many things at the moment which feel like the 1930s again. And if we had that, then we would be back in that place. And that's, for all of us, a deeply frightening situation. So we might be having some minor kind of dances with Macron about how we position ourselves on defense, or, you know, who's got the better vaccines or whatever. But in the end, if we end up with our closest neighbour being, apart from Ireland, of course, but having, you know, a fascist government, then we are in very, very dangerous place.
Great.
I don't want to talk us into a spiral, Mike. We always end up on these calls needing a stiff drink at the end of them. But, you know, we have to face these really difficult threats, and the left has to pull together and stop arguing about things like Scotland or, you know, Ireland or whatever, and start worrying about the far right.
I know, I agree with you. I mean, these are the challenges that we face, and the ones that we're not dealing with very effectively. Right, we're almost out of time, so I'll come to each of you for brief final comments if I can. Just want to mention a couple of questions in the chat that if one or more of you wanted to cover, you could. One on smuggling and the likelihood of smuggling weapons, guns, explosives into the country by terrorists or otherwise, because our borders aren't really controlled at the moment. And one on Ukraine, and the question is, how close are we to a hot war in Ukraine? You know, is it likely to turn into a live conflict? And if it does, what do we do? So, Fabian, I'll come to you, please. If you want to cover those, please do. Otherwise, just brief final comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Look, I think we, on this call tonight, we all know, and that's why we're here, that the future for human society is collaboration and cooperation, and not the kind of self-introspection that we've had for these last few years in this country, which leads to breakup and it leads to disaster. I just wanted to comment briefly on what Catherine said. I think, Catherine, you spelt out a possible outcome and future in France. I know France very well. Many of my family still live in France, and I followed French politics for a long time, and I speak very fluent French. I still think it's an unlikely outcome. I agree with what you said about Macron. He is aloof. He has made a lot of mistakes. He was very inexperienced when he became president. And his government hasn't been that impressive. But ultimately, I don't believe that the majority of French voters are pro-fascist. However tempting Marine Le Pen might be, I honestly don't think if it's a runoff between them, French voters will plump for Marine Le Pen, whatever they think of Macron. They'll go for the lesser of the two evils, and that's always going to be Macron, or whoever's standing against somebody as wicked as Le Pen. That's just my own thoughts. I'm not the Shadow Europe Minister anymore. I was briefly at one stage. Look, on the smuggling of weapons, thank you for that, putting that in the chat, whoever did. You know, it's really important, if you are determined to control your own borders, that you actually do that and you put the resources into it. You know, one of the biggest causes of death in places like Africa every single day is the proliferation of small arms. It kills more people in a single day than AIDS and malaria put together. So we have to address this problem of small arms proliferation, as well as nuclear weapons and other horrific man-made weapons of destruction. And that means controlling our borders and putting the resources into it to stop that smuggling of illegal weapons. It will always go on. Those criminals will try and do it, but we've got to clamp down hard. And that means intelligence. And intelligence means sharing information with our allies and trusted partners in Europe and the United States. I really hope that the sooner the British government understands and realizes that, the sooner we can get back involved closely with those allies to keep ourselves secure, as well as all the other things we need to do. But thanks for inviting me tonight, and thanks to all of you for the questions you've asked, and to my excellent fellow panelists.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fabian. Claire, straight over to you, please.
Lovely, thank you. I'm going to pick up on a couple of points, or a couple of the questions. The strategic autonomy point is much bigger than France. It's it is an EU-wide issue. It had many parents. One of the parents of strategic autonomy as an idea was Brexit. Another one was Trump. Another one was actually, this is a fact that kind of survives into the Biden administration as well. But the US thinks that the EU should take more, or the Europe, as a wider term, should take responsibility for looking after itself. And they're right. We should take responsibility for looking after ourselves. It's just unfortunate the UK is not playing a constructive role in that right now, and indeed becoming a very unreliable partner for the US in relation to them wanting to turn more to the Pacific field rather than the Atlantic field in security. The UK government makes strategic errors all over the place, frankly. I mean, I've never seen in my lifetime such an incapable government and such a weak cabinet. And one of the strategic errors they make is thinking that they can deal with EU member states bilaterally, and that somehow bypasses the need for the relationship with the European Union. So there is an organization called the E3, which was instrumental in the creation of the JCPOA. And there's an organization called the Quad, which is the E3 plus America, the E3 being the UK, France, and Germany. The UK government thinks that somehow that substitutes all their other relationships around security and defense. And of course it doesn't, because France and Germany are first, middle and last EU member states. So there are layers of relationships that happen, like we all have layers of identity. And the UK thinks it can take the EU identity out of those other countries when it is dealing with them bilaterally. And that is a category error. It is a strategic error of enormous proportions, and it leads to bad decision making and a very poor choices around foreign policy. The strategic review that Catherine mentioned earlier was blank on the EU, which was an immensely poor thing to do. So, there is huge space for us as the Labour Party in taking on this agenda, owning this agenda, and building on exactly what Fabian said, that the way forward for humanity, never mind the Labour Party, is to deal with the issues that face us is through collaboration and cooperation, and exposing the frailties of the divisive and flawed mechanisms that this government is using around this area. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Claire. Christos, final comment.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be brief. I think collaboration on the international scene is called multilateralism, and that's built on trust and the ability to build long-lasting relationship with your partners. And what this government has done after the Brexit divorce is trying to have this kind of promiscuous approach, and they call it pragmatic, working with the E3 here, with the US there, and Germany and France here and there. That will not work. And I think the first example for that will be COP26, where the government will need a success, and that success is only possible if you work closely with the United States and the European Union. And this is a chance, I think, for the Labour Party to show that the clown king on the global stage doesn't work. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Catherine.
Thank you, Mike. And just as a finishing up, over the Easter break, Lisa Nandy, who is the Shadow Foreign Secretary and lead of our team, talked about making the connections between good foreign policy and good domestic policy, and the fact that, the regions which haven't done well in the UK, making the case that, we need to have strong trade, strong human rights, and strong approaches to defence and security, and that's how we can try and make that join up at regional level. And of course, that's so important in democracy, because in autocratic countries, you don't have to worry about your regions in a way, because they'll never come back to get you. But obviously, it goes to the heart of what we do, is to try and bring up the living standards of all of our regions. And so I think there's a real challenge there. And we haven't quite got there yet, because we've got 2 years before we have to write our manifesto. But somehow we have to learn from other places, whether it's the discontent that we might be seeing in France, for example, that I mentioned, or whether it's the some of the rays of sunlight coming from the US with the new arrangements around looking at taxation again, looking at equality, looking at a jobs plan, investing in infrastructure. You know, we can, if we join together, we can have that peaceful and more equal society, but we have got to work at it. And I think there's been so much complacency and not standing up for the things which matter, which brings me round to my little sermon that I gave at the beginning of this week. You do funny jobs when you're a constituency MP. But, you know, we do have to really make sure that we fight for the things that matter. And that is about the solidarity, the multilateralism, and that peaceful future that we all know is the way forward. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of our speakers and to all of our attendees. That's been a really valuable session. Thank you so much. I've certainly learned a lot this evening. So I posted in the chat that this will go up on our YouTube channel tomorrow in the next few days. We're back on Monday at 6 p.m. for our next webinar, which will be on Scotland and how Scotland can maintain a close relationship with the EU without, hopefully, independence, certainly from my perspective. So do join us then if you can. And we've got a new podcast going up tomorrow, I think, as well, which is on a year of care and what we've all learned. So if you have a chance to listen to that. We've all learned a great deal, I think. And finally, just thank you so much again to our speakers. It's been really wonderful to have you here. And I'm sure we will come back to this topic because it's, I mean, we haven't really scratched the surface of it this evening. It's a huge topic and it's going to become more and more important, I think, for us as a country as the remaining years of this government go by. And certainly we on the Labour side need to not only have a clear plan for what we're going to do to put things right, which I know that you guys are working on, and I'm hugely grateful for that. But we also need to be communicating that, you know, very clearly to the public, so that well, A, so that they vote for us, and B, so that they understand the implications of, you know, another Tory term or a much better Labour term. So without further ado, we will leave it there. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the evening, and I'll see you all soon.